Sagastizábal from Unicamp and CeMEAI, and I will be chairing the second edition that will put a focus on the mathematics of contributions, mathematical contributions in South America related to COVID-19. Before starting, I would like to acknowledge the support of FAPESP that has been quite formidable, helping us organizing this meeting. FAPESP is a research foundation of the state of Sao Paulo in Brazil. Thank you very much. Muito obrigada. Now I will pass the mic to the scientific director of FAPESP, Professor Luiz Eugênio Mello.
Thank you, Claudia. We're quite happy to host this second event. Science is all about sharing, and this is specifically dedicated to sharing our experiences in terms of the mathematical modeling and understanding based on science of the current epidemic. On this event, we have colleagues not only from Brazil, but also from Argentina, Chile, Colombia, and Ecuador. Again, we as scientists all believe that knowledge is acquired not only by experimenting, but also by sharing. And that's the main intent of this event. I would like to especially thank Claudia and Cuminato for proposing or organizing this event, and also mention that it is currently being co-sponsored by the Global Research Council, GRC, to which FAPESP is also a member. Thank you, Claudia, and back to you.
Okay, thank you. Let me start with just some putting in context this meeting. This edition is an initiative of CeMEAI, which is the Center for Mathematical Sciences Applied to Industry. CeMEAI is one of the centers funded by FAPESP to explore the frontiers of knowledge, in our case, in industrial mathematics. And our mission is to develop new transformative mathematical techniques and explore the application of those techniques for the benefit of society. So this is a very opportune moment to put in play all this knowledge that has been gathered in the group. And so we will focus today then on contributions on a broader scale, in fact, than just of CeMEAI in the whole of South America. CeMEAI, like the mathematical community all around the globe, stepped in with force to respond to the pandemics of COVID-19. We are learning and absorbing new information like sponges at very fast speed, trying to support with the rigor of math the decision-making of governments. This is a very hard task, and it's very important to have the rigor and systematic approach of mathematics. But as it has been said, this is a marathon and it's not a sprint. It seems the time has come to take a step back, to breathe a little bit deeper and find out what is being done around us, not only just to answer to the immediate needs, but to learn from experiences of colleagues, to avoid duplicating efforts, enriching our view, perhaps fostering collaborations. This is why in this webinar, we will have a panorama of actions taken in different groups of applied math in South America, because we have more in common than what than with Europe, for example, or another continent. It is important for us to learn also from the experience of other colleagues. So we have separated the 6 talks into 2 blocks. Each one will last 1 hour, and it is each block has 3 talks of 15 minutes. The last 15 minutes of each hour will be dedicated to questions that you can send by email to the address live@fapesp.br. Please, we encourage you to participate, to contribute. It's very important for us to have views and exchange ideas. So feel free to send your comments. We will try to answer the most of them live, and then afterwards, perhaps continuing on a private channel if time doesn't allow us. Another thing that I want to tell you is that, as Professor Mello said, we are being supported, this activity is supported by GRC, the Global Research Council, and that the conference will be, is being taped, and it will be afterwards available in YouTube. Okay, I think with that, we can now pass to presenting each one of the speakers. So let me, I don't want to make mistakes. So we will have, I will go in the order of their talks. Then we will have Paulo José da Silva from IMEC in Unicamp and CeMEAI in Brazil. Thank you. Then we will have Pedro Gajardo from Universidad Técnica Federico Santa María in Chile. Afterwards, Maurício Velasco from Universidad de los Andes in Bogotá, Colombia. This will be the first block of talks dedicated to mitigation strategies and testing. In the second hour after the questions and answers, the second block will be devoted to tools to support the design of public policies. Here we will have a talk by Juan Carlos de los Reyes from the Centro de Modelización Matemática, MODEMAT, in Escuela Politécnica Nacional in Ecuador. Then we will have a talk by Francisco Louzada Neto from ICMC, USP, and CeMEAI in Brazil. And we'll close the second block before the questions with a presentation by Pablo Lotito from PLADEMA, the Facultad de Ciencias Exactas of the UNCPBA and CONICET in Argentina. So I hope we will have, I'm sure, we will have a wonderful meeting. Thank you all for being here and participating. So I guess now we will give the word to Paulo.
Okay, thank you, Claudia. Let me share my screen and start talking. Okay, let's see if this is going to work. Okay, so here we go. So I'm going to talk about a joint work with two colleagues from USP, Luiz and Thiago Pereira, and also now with Claudia Sagastizábal. And we're going to talk about strategy to design automatically mitigation profiles for COVID-19. So this is the outline of the talk, and we start talking about mitigation strategies, okay? So in the state of São Paulo, we are located in the state of São Paulo, basically here, most of the authors. So what we had at the beginning was a simultaneous implementation of a mitigation protocol of social isolation, a quarantine for all the state. Unfortunately, it's quite clear now that this kind of strategy will have to last for a long time. And it's not clear that the protocol should be homogeneous. Maybe it should take into account the different stages or differences between the cities of the regions of the state, okay? So right now, from June 1st, from the beginning of this week, the state changed its protocol, and now it's using some criteria based on the healthcare and ICU capacity and the evolution of the infected, so that they can design different protocols for each city, for each region actually, not cities, it's in a regional level in the state. And these different protocols, they allow different sectors of the economy to open depending on the stage of the epidemic at each region, okay? The state is also saying that's going to improve testing, because testing is a major problem here in Brazil right now. And one of the things about this protocol is that it is essentially reactive. What I mean with that is that instead of trying to drive the epidemic in a certain way, it will react to the past. So we'll have better testing, we'll know how the epidemic is, and then we decide what we can do and what we cannot do, okay? So what did we try to achieve with our research? We have try to achieve, to use an optimal control framework that will be used to design the mitigation strategy, the isolation protocol. And it takes into account the intercity commuting and the health structure at each region. And it tries to orchestrate the control among the cities or the regions in order to avoid that all of them has to be stopped, to be closed at the same time, okay? And by doing that, you allow at least part of the economy of the state to remain working. And it has to be flexible because we need to be able to allow for multiple scenarios. So, for example, we have to be able to simulate what happened if we consider that all the health structure is shared among all the places of the states, or if only by region, and other things. And as anything that is based on numbers, we depend on good data. So in order to do something that looks like this, we need to have a good testing framework put in place in the region that we want to control. Okay. Okay. And since we want to design this quarantine among many regions of city, it's very important for us to introduce the idea that people can move from one region to the other, to take into account how the disease can spread from one place to the other. And we then added to the CeMEAI model some information about the commuting, the daily commuting that you can see between regions or between cities, which is very important in the state of São Paulo. Okay, so what now we have, basically have a different CeMEAI model for each of the regions of the cities. So we have SI, EI, II, and RI, and for each region, I, okay, and we divide each of these variables, the susceptible, the incumbent, the infected, and the R, we divide them in fractions of the populations of the city I's that leave it to work at city J. So we are focusing here on the daily commute for working, which is the most important relationship we can have between the cities. But we are not taking into account, for example, touristic travels or anything like that. And that for a touristic place might not be good, but we have to start somewhere, okay? So what we do is that now the derivative of the susceptible does not only depend on the infected in the city I, but also on the infected in the city J. So we have to split the susceptible from city I that go to city J, and they will see the infected in city J. So this is the basically change we do in the CeMEAI model, and this couple all the regions once you do that, okay? And you also have to do some kind of normalization on the population because since you have people live in the city to work and people coming from other cities to work in this city, the population during the day is not going to add up to 1 anymore. It might be larger because the city receives many workers, or might be smaller because it gives workers to other regions, okay? And well, at night, we assume that everyone goes back to their own city and spend the night there, so they can still, they can get infected in another city, and when they come back, they can infect people in their own city, okay? This is the basic idea, okay? And this is how the model looks like. Basically, what you have here is now you have terms that are important during the day. And this happens when this alpha function, which is a square pulse, is equal to 1. And during the night, you get back to the original CeMEAI model that we are used to, okay? And okay, so this is the basic idea. And our question, we wanted to see if this kind of model was able to capture the effect of having interrelationship between the cities. Now the optimization, the control approach. So what we want to do, we want to formulate a control problem that tries to drive the CeMEAI dynamics using the reproduction number as control. So here, what we have to think about is that what we do when you do social distancing or a quarantine, what you're trying to do is we're trying to decrease the reproduction number of the disease. You are trying to avoid the spread of the disease, okay? So what we are trying to achieve here is controlling the profile of the epidemic by controlling the reproduction number, okay? So since the epidemic can be described, the evolution of the epidemic can be described by a differential equation, and you have a control variable, this is basically a control problem, okay? So we are going to use this, we're going to model our design of the profile of the quarantine as a control problem. In this control problem, you have the differential equations, and you have to discretize the differential equations to put them in a format that can be solved in a computer, okay? So you have a discretized version of your model, which is basically here modeled here by this first constraint, which says that the CeMEAI dynamic has to belong to this dm of R, and this dm is the discretized model, which is a function of the controls of the R. And then you can also have other constraints that we call operational constraints. We're going to talk about them later. All the CeMEAI variables have to sum up to 1 because the populations, they have to remain constant. We're not taking into account the births, and the deaths actually are taken into account because we're assuming that they're going to remain in the R variable, okay? And your control, which is the little r here, it has to be positive because you cannot make, you don't have, I don't know, you don't have anything that can make the spreading of the virus lesser than 0, okay? And it has to be smaller than the R naught, the basal reproduction number of the disease, okay? So what we're going to do here, we're going to try to solve this problem, and we have to define an objective function, which we'll show in a moment. So about the constraints. So we have the constraint that says that the CeMEAI dynamics has to conform with the CeMEAI variables have to conform to the CeMEAI dynamic, okay? And we are discretizing this CeMEAI problem using a Runge-Kutta method of second order, which is the modified Euler method. This is an easy dynamics to discretize. It's not stiff, so basically any reasonable method will do. And in the operational constraints, what we have to take into account is the initial conditions. So we have to have, we need to have a good idea of how the epidemic is right now. So for this, we need good testing, okay? And we are assuming that the controls, they can only change among time windows. So we're assuming that for a certain number of days, the controls will remain constant because we cannot ask for the population to change the behavior from day to day. We also have constraints that try to take into account the healthcare constraints, which is basically says that the number of infected cannot be so large that the public healthcare system cannot cope with those people, with those infected people. Okay, and you have to take that into account between the cities or all of the state. And as objective function, what we're trying to do here is that we're trying to disrupt the normal life. So we want the control, the target reproduction number to be close to R naught. So this is what the first term says. So we're trying to do as less quarantine, as less social isolation as possible. But we also want each city to alternate in time. So we don't want any city to stay closed for a very long period of time, because this would be very stressful, for example, from the psychological point of view. And we also want to make the regions alternate in space. And what we mean here is that we want that at a certain moment of time, part of the cities, they can be in quarantine, but another part of the cities, they have to be open so that the economy of the state will remain working at least partially all the time. So this is what we have in the objective functions. Those are three objectives that are actually in conflict with one another. So we have to balance among them using weights. Okay, and those weights have come from the decision makers. Okay, just a quick view of the case studies. We implemented this. and we do some tests with 11 cities in the state of São Paulo. We are assuming here very optimistic, we are being very optimistic about the capacity of the healthcare system. For example, we're assuming that the city of São Paulo can sustain 1.5% of the population sick at a certain moment of time, while in the interior part of the state, only 0.7. We are doing controls in a time window of 14 days, 2 weeks. We have implemented this in Julia and Jump to allow for rapid prototyping, and we are using the IP-op nonlinear programming solver. And this is what was going to happen if we just left things as they are now. We would have a large peak in São Paulo around the end of this month, with more than 3% of the population sick at a certain moment, which is much larger than the 1.5 that we have. And here we can also see that the cities nearby São Paulo, because São Paulo is going to have a larger capacity of taking care of the sick, it can actually end the epidemic sooner, and that would, in some sense, protect the cities nearby São Paulo. So the part of the equation that is taking into account the movement between the people among the cities is actually working. And this is one of our mitigation profiles. So here for all the cities, São Paulo, São Bernardo, and so on, what we have here is that if you have a red square, in that time window of 14 days, the city has to be basically open in a lockdown. But if you have a white square, the city can actually live a life very close to normal life. So what we want to show here is that after an initial period of strong quarantine, the cities can start alternating between open and closed, not only each one of the cities, but also some cities will be open while others are closed. So you can keep part of the population always working, okay? This is another simulation. Here we allow São Paulo extra capacity to help the cities of the interior. And you see that in this case, the time that you need for the strong quarantine in the interior decreases because it's actually using in the future the capacity of São Paulo. So these are the conclusions. We have adapted the CER model to take into account daily commuting. We implemented a framework for rapid prototyping of mitigation controls. It is predictive and not reactive. The mitigation will last for long. We have to learn to live with it, but we can alternate between a more severe and less severe among cities and to keep part of the state open. The framework is flexible and allows us to quickly test other operational constraints and or objectives. And we still have a to-do list here. Currently, the code can only cope with tens of cities. If you go to 100, we will not have enough memory. We are trying to solve this by getting rid of the state variables that are not necessary. Basically, only need a control because this is initial time partial differential equation. We can use the sliding horizon and some other technique to allow for shorter simulations. And we should add stochasticity to the model to model the error on the data. And now there we have the report and the code that you can download. Thank you. I'm done. Okay, let me close my.
Mute. Okay, thank you very much, Paulo, for this nice talk. It's a very, very impressive work. I will now pass to our second speaker. Please, Pedro Gajardo from University of Chile.
Thank you. I'm sharing my screen. I think it is okay. So
okay.
Yeah. So sorry. Okay. So thank you, Claudia, and thank you to the FAPESP team for the organization of this webinar, for the kind invitation. For me, it is a pleasure to be here and to have the opportunity to present a brief summary of the work developed with this team, a team from my university, from CMM, and from the Center of Epidemiology and Health Policies in Chile. I would like to start talking about the context, because for us the context is not the same as in a research project or in a normal collaboration. I think it is the same for the other speakers. So instead to do as in a normal situation, from the beginning, we commit ourselves to report periodically some message or try to provide some recommendations based in a mathematical model approach, of course. So from March, we have published 2 reports per month, documents sent to some authorities, the Advisory Committee COVID-19 in Chile, and the community. This Advisory Committee COVID-19 in Chile, it is a kind of a response team of epidemiologists that advise to the Chilean government during this emergency. Sometimes we have seen that the advice of this committee are taken into account for the government with some weeks of delay. So in each report, we have tried to transmit some message or answer to a specific questions. For instance, in April, the government asked to the scientific community to model the reopening of schools and commerce. In Chile, we have identified around 20 groups working on modeling for the COVID, and we write a sort of common answer where we did not recommend to open the school at this time. Our framework is a semi-quantitative analysis. We use this term in order to explain the difference for the community and also for the press with a forecasting purpose. So our concern is to observe the effects of a strategy, and mainly the effects on the maximal ICU demand in quantity and in rate, instead of estimating the number of infected people next week. So we have worked as case of study with 6 Chilean regions, the blue one in the map, and corresponded to the 65% of the Chilean population. We have worked with a compartmental model with ordinary differential equations, where we consider eight state variables. So the main feature is to divide infected people in symptomatic and asymptomatic or mild symptomatic or subclinical people, as the early literature on the COVID suggested in December and January, because the asymptomatic people is very important in the dynamics of the disease. So we model the rate of contagious as the probability of contagious times the rate of contacts, and we use the rate of contacts as the control variable. So reducing the rate of contacts before the pandemics with a factor in 0.1. Capital X here means represent the stage, different stage of the disease. So the strategies that we can represent with this approach are the lockdowns, reducing the contact rates for everybody, the contact tracing and isolation, reducing the contact rates for some specific stage of the disease, and also the closure of or reopening of schools. For doing that, we have to consider an age structure to this model, and considering matrix, contact matrix and the standard approach. So now we are working a new model because some weeks ago, Chilean authorities started to report a symptomatic case. In the first model, in the previous one, we assumed that the symptomatic are reported and asymptomatic are not reported. So now we are working this new model. And the advantage of this is to have a new source of data for calibration. And also we can represent other strategies as screening-based strategy. So here, symptomatic and asymptomatic people, we divided in detected and undetected. And during people being in this stage represent the time taken from the beginning of symptoms, or well, not symptoms, in this case, the beginning of symptoms, and the time to take for these people is reported in this direction. Concerning the parameters, we calibrate using the daily report of cases, people using ICU beds and death. Also, we compute the effective reproductive number and we calibrate with respect to this indicator. Here we have a visualization. We implement this front-end visualization in this web page where we compute the effective reproductive number for the regions in Chile. Of course, we have other sources as international reference, for instance, for the contact metrics for the H-class models, expert judgment assumptions, mainly from epidemiologists, and the Google activity reports. That is like a proxy for the reduction of activity after the mitigation and contention strategy are applied. So here we see an example of our first model calibrated with data until March 31. And here you can see the comparison with the cumulative cases during April and May. So you can see the fit is pretty good. The fit is pretty good. So this is good news for the model, but it's not at all good news for the current situation in Santiago. This is in Santiago. So because we are here, we don't know. Okay. A brief summary of the message and answer that we have published in our report is in March. We said, warning, it is important to implement a contact tracing and isolation strategy. We call this strategy CeMEAI. We also modeled at this time the effect of the asymptomatic people in the dynamics of the, so we model different scenarios because there is a lot of uncertainty about the percentage of asymptomatic people in the population. In April, we insist with the contact tracing and isolation is the most effective strategy among the strategy we model. We model specific lockdowns in some regions in Chile, and we conclude that such lockdowns at this period only achieve the peaks. So lockdowns at this stage can be seen as an opportunity to buy time in order to prepare a contact tracing program. And at the beginning of May, we model the opening of schools in different scenarios. The scenario related with the progress of contact tracing program and a scenario related also with the percentage of the open of the school. So here you can see in this panel the curve of hospitalized people in different scenarios in Santiago. So the blue curve corresponds to the situation with closest schools. Lately, we have worked in a type of cost-effective analysis as a first attempt to take into account the social and economic impact of the mitigation measures. So let me explain a little bit more about that. In Chile, since March, lockdowns are applied to some cities or districts. To implement lockdowns by zone in a large city as Santiago seems to be original. I don't know other examples. In the map, you can see an announcement explaining what district in Santiago will have lockdowns and where the lockdowns is released. So this is Santiago, and these are the different district communities. In May, authorities explain how they activate these lockdowns, and mainly they use the number of active cases per 100,000 people and per square kilometer mainly. So in a general setting, a dynamic lockdown for some specific zone, city, or region is activated when one epidemiological indicator overshoots a threshold. Here I write the epidemiological indicator with capital I and the threshold theta. So the lockdown is released when the level of indicator decreases enough. The indicator we study are the active cases, new cases, people in ICU beds, and the rate of ICU occupancy, how many people arrive to the ICU per day. When we use an indicator with a given threshold, Suppose we are interested only in two quantities as product of this strategy. The one quantity, the peak of ICU demand, and the total days in lockdown at the second quantity. So for the same indicator, if we change the threshold, we will have another output, another peak of ICU demand and another number of total days in lockdown. So the output of the strategy can be put in a plane. So here the ICU peak demand, if we apply one indicator with one threshold, and the total days in lockdown. If we change the thresholds, we have another peak of the ICU demand and another total days of lockdowns. So of course, we would like to have the minimum of these values, but there is a natural trade-off that I try to illustrate here with this curve. If we want, for instance, if we want a lower level of the peak of ICU demand, changing the threshold, we will imply more days, that will imply more days in lockdowns. So this is the curve of trade-off. So we call like that this curve associated to one indicator, and we propose compare two indicators using this curve as I illustrate here. So we have the trade-off curve for the indicator A in red and for the indicator B in blue. And in this illustration, we can see that indicator B is better than indicator A in the sense that for the same ICU peak demand, we using indicator B will imply less days in lockdown. So here we have the real curves of trade-off in three regions of Chile. Again, in the x-axis is the ICU peak demand obtained from the applied strategy, and in the y-axis is the total days in lockdown. Here we can observe that the best curves are the purple one. This is the trade-off curve corresponding to the rate of ICU occupancy. And also the blue one is the curve associated to the using active case. The problem with this indicator is that the quantity of active case is very hard to observe accurately. So, okay. And in each panel, you can see a vertical line. This is a target of the peak of ICU demand. Here in the region of Antofagasta, 100 beds. In Valparaiso, also 100 beds. And in Santiago, 2,000 beds. So for each of these target, we compute the threshold for the best two indicator. What is the threshold to consider? So you can see in this table, in the metropolitan region, this is Santiago, for a peak of 2,000 beds, the threshold for the active case is 330 infected people per 100,000 people. And the threshold for the ICU occupancy, daily rate of ICU occupancy is 30. That means in metropolitan region, if we receive daily 30 or more people, new people in the ICU, the lockdown should be activated. Some message from this study that only lockdowns are not the solution. It is also necessary to implement a strategy of contact tracing and isolation, because if we only apply this kind of lockdowns, we will need a lot of time in order to decrease the peaks. So if lockdowns are part of the strategy, we don't say that the lockdowns are good or are bad. But if lockdowns are part of the strategy, like it is in Chile and in many countries, our recommendation is to use the rate of ICU occupancy to activate them, because it is the best in terms of its cost effectivity, in the sense less days in lockdowns with lower peaks of ICU demand, and it is based on more reliable data. If the rate of ICU occupancy is considered for activated lockdowns, this measure needs to be applied to the entire population, susceptible to use the ICU service where the indicator is observed. That seems obvious, but we are trying to say that it's not cost effective to apply lockdown to a smaller population. So this may lead to longer lockdowns longer lockdowns periods for population with less ICU beds. So we recommend to integrate health facility to larger networks in order to decrease the days in lockdowns, like in Chile, authorities do that. But nevertheless, when a lockdown needs to be implemented, it must be applied to a larger population. That's the problem. So some few words as final comment. The contact tracing and isolation is the most effective strategy. Technical and normative discussion are needed. For the control of the outbreak, it is necessary to identify what are the observable quantities, because policies should be based on these observations. And as future work, we are thinking to integrate the interconnection between district and regions with a approach, like with a Lagrangian approach, and to think in other feedback rules for releasing lockdowns to some groups. There are some works showing that for lifting measure, one has to start with groups of low risk. I think the next speaker is going to talk about that. Groups of low risk as young people. So we are interested in what indicator to use for deciding when to release some of these works, and also to model a screen-based strategy and the use of masks. So thank you very much. You can see our report in this webpage.
Thank you very much, Pedro. It's very interesting to know what, it's an impressive amount of work that you have been doing there. It's really, congratulations. So we will pass now to our next speaker, Maurício Velasco from Universidad de los Andes in Bogotá, Colombia. Mauricio, please.
Yes, so thanks very much. Can you hear me, Claudia? Hello?
Yes. Yes.
Okay, good. Excellent. Okay, so first of all, I want to thank the organizers for the opportunity of giving this talk. The title of the talk is called Optimal Pool Testing Protocols for COVID-19. My original intention was to also speak about risk-based quarantine, but I wasn't able to fit it in the 15 minutes. Maybe this is something we can discuss later. So the results in this talk are joint work with Manu Forero and Juan Pedraza, both at Universidad de los Andes in Bogotá, Colombia. Okay, so how to face COVID-19? This is a difficult question. We have discussed many strategies, but all these strategies share this message that was given by the Director General in March 16, which is the enormous importance of testing. Now, let's talk a little bit about what are these tests and how mathematics can help us to make them more efficient. So how are active infection tests done? The method is called PCR, polymerase chain reaction, and it's a process of amplification of viral RNA, for which Carey Mullis was given the Nobel Prize of Chemistry in 1993. So basically, you take a sample and you run this amplification procedure, and after a while, the procedure gives you a yes or a no to which answers the question of whether the sample contains RNA of SARS-CoV-2. So maybe the main point is that PCR tests have an almost perfect sensitivity and specificity. They really are the gold standard of testing. So the information you get from them is very reliable. And this is why we like them. Now, the disadvantage is that these tests are very expensive. They need specific regions, which we call primers. They need a lot of time, around 4 hours, although they can be run in parallel. They need trained personnel, and also they need expensive machinery, which is not available everywhere. So this brings us to the problem that motivates this talk, which is that we have a set of people, let's say N persons, of which a small number is infected. This N is not the whole population, but only the population you intend to test during, let's say, a day. And now among these N persons, only a small number, K, is infected. And the question is whether you can find these K persons by using less than N tests. So currently, the way this is done is you take your n samples, you test each of them individually, and you report the results. And the question is whether you have alternatives that are more efficient than doing this. Now, the key parameter to see how good a strategy can you use is the concept of prevalence, defined as K over N, which is the proportion of people that are ill in this population you want to sample. Just for indication, in current COVID testing in Colombia, prevalence fluctuates depending on the target population, but it's typically between 5% and 20%. Maybe a little bit less, maybe a little bit more, but that range is really where the actual range of interest in practice. Okay, so what do you do to try to solve this problem? There is an old idea from 1943 by Dorfman in a paper in the Annals of Statistics, which proposed the following approach. So what you do is you take your samples and split them into groups of 3. And in each of these groups of 3, you do the following 2-step procedure. So first, you take your 3 samples and you create a pool with them that combines the 3 samples. What this means is you take a little bit of fluid from the first sample, a little bit of fluid from the second, a little bit of fluid from the third, and you just put them together in a new sample, and then you test the combined sample. If the combined sample gives you a negative answer, then you can guarantee that the 3 patients were not ill. And so you're good. You have used just one test to decide whether 3 people are ill. On the other hand, if the combined testing gives you a positive answer, then you don't know. It could be that only one of them is sick, or that 2 of them are, or that everyone is, and you don't know. And so what you have to do is, in a second stage, which is the second step of the 2-step pooling protocol, you need to retest them individually. Okay, and so when the combined test comes out positive, you lose because you're using 4 tests in order to test 3 people. So overall, it's not clear whether you win or you lose, and this will depend upon how large is the prevalence of your population. So can we really quantify how good is a testing scheme or a pool testing scheme? The key point is to look at this function, delta of P, which measures the expected number of tests you use per patient, okay? So this is a curve because your x-axis is the prevalence and the values of delta of P are drawn in the figure. And if your curve is lower, then you're better off. You have a better pool testing method. So for instance, if you analyze this delta of P curve for the pooling protocol I just described, you find out that if the prevalence is less than 30%, then you gain. You are better off by using this pool testing than by just testing persons one at a time. And the key point is that you do this without any loss of accuracy whatsoever. This is a very simple idea that will make your investment be much better. You can test more people. So the question is, can we do better? Can we propose better protocols than this naive one that I just described, which I will call the one-dimensional pooling protocol? Well, it turns out that 2-dimensional protocols have been proposed. This is an idea that people keep rediscovering. In the math literature, there was an article in the 2000 by Berger, Mandela, Subramanian, which addresses this fully. And as a result of COVID, a group at Stanford just rediscovered this kind of pooling. So instead of describing it, I will show you by picture what do you have to do. So you're given a collection of samples and you now split them into chunks of 64, yes? And each of these 64 samples you place in a matrix, like the one that I've drawn here, which has 8 rows and 8 columns. Each rectangle represents a patient, and the ones that are red represent patients that are ill. And you're trying to find the red rectangle, the red circles among all the rectangles. So what the protocol does is the following. In the first stage, you do 16 measurements. You basically take pools along the rows and pools along the columns, and you write down your results. So all I do is I use 16 tests to measure the combined pooling of the rows and columns. So if I do that with my set of ill people, what I will obtain are these red dots that have now appeared on the screen. And in practice, what happens is you will not know who is ill, but you will only know in the first stage the red dots that are drawn now, okay? And the question is, if you know that the combined pools are of this form, can you find out who is ill? And if you think about it a little bit, you will soon enough discover that what you can guarantee is that no one in the white squares has the disease, and that the sick people are contained in the green circles. You don't know that the green circles are all sick, but you know that everyone who's sick is contained in there. So what if you use the second stage, in which you test each of the green circles individually? And then as a result, you discover which are the 80 persons. And the key point is that you have done this protocol by using very few tests. So you used 16 to set up the pooled measurements of columns and rows, and then you use 9 more to test individually each of the green dots. So you get a total of 25, and 25 is a lot less than 64. So just by using 25 tests, you just tested 64 persons without any loss of accuracy. And again, the question is, how does this behave on average? And you can analyze this quantity. So you can try to compare our new 2-dimensional matrix protocol with the original 1-dimensional protocol and ask which one is better. And the answer is neither of them are. This depends on the prevalence. As this picture shows, if the prevalence is less than 10%, then you should do pooling by matrix methods. And if the prevalence is more than 10%, then you should do pooling by just small groups, so by this 1-dimensional method that we did before. Now, does the difference matter? I mean, you look at the curves and they look pretty close. One might say, well, this doesn't make much of a difference. So then you use these efficiency diagrams, which are the reciprocal of the picture that I just showed you, which is what planners really like, because it tells you for an investment of 1 kit, how many people can I test? Yes. And you see that the difference is enormous. You can, instead of, if your prevalence is sufficiently low, then you can basically test 4 persons per test if you use the matrix method, while only 3 if you use the other method. And since we want to test large samples of people, this is really very significant. So after you see this, then we can really get to a purely mathematical problem. Suppose that the size of pooling is bounded by a certain quantity. You only allow pools of at most C things. Yeah, in our original 1-dimensional pooling, C was 3. In the matrix pooling, C is 8. And you ask, what is, for a given C, the best possible pooling testing scheme you can have? This is now a well-defined mathematical problem. And maybe as a quick remark, is not an easy problem in the sense that there are infinitely many possible pooling schemes. For instance, if I only look at pooling schemes that allow you to pool 2 samples, so when C is equal to 2, there are exactly as many pooling schemes as there are graphs. So there are infinitely many, and this is like a large and complicated set. And so it came to us kind of as a surprise that we were able to prove a theorem that really answers this question completely. More specifically, the theorem we proved is you give me a number C, and then I can run a computer program that will give you a list of the optimal testing protocols. In the case of Colombia, for instance, regulations of our National Institute of Health say that C has to be at most 8. And in some theoretical, some experiments we did at the lab at the university, we believe that C up to 16 is useful. But beyond that, then you start losing information. So in practice, what you want to know is what are the best testing schemes for C equal to 8? And this is what our first theorem summarizes. So this is joint work with Mano, Forero, and Juan Pedraza. And what we proved is that if the pool size is at most 8, then there are 7 different optimal or mixed testing schemes. There are only these 7, and I can tell you exactly which one do you have to use according to the prevalence that you have. So to read this diagram, you should begin by pooling in sets of 8, and then as your prevalence increases, 1-dimensional pooling in sets of 8. And then as your prevalence increases, you should use matrices of size 8 by 8, then matrices of size 7 by 7, matrices of size 6 by 6, and then at the end, when the prevalence is really big, you should go back to 1-dimensional pooling of sizes 4 and 3. And this is the absolute best thing that you can do. It's a mathematical certainty of this fact. So very, very briefly, what are the ideas? The ideas are, for the proof of this statement, is that if the pooling scheme is very symmetric, you can actually understand the delta function explicitly. It turns out to be a polynomial. And then if you have a complicated pooling scheme, it turns out to always have a delta, which is an average of the polynomials we constructed earlier. And thus, to minimize, all you need to do is to find the minimum of these highly structured guys. And this is how our theorem works. So just one more slide. If you analyze the same phenomena for 16, then there are more optimal on mixed testing strategies, which are drawn on the slide. This fairly complicated set, where maybe the interesting thing is that now different pooling schemes appear. You need to use some three-dimensional pooling schemes that one can also describe. And if you look at them from the point of view of efficiency, it turns out that you can really increase your return on investment, maybe even up to 8 if you manage your prevalences very well. To summarize, this is a simple idea that you can implement very easily and that can really increase the amount of testing you do with zero investment. And this is what I wanted to share with you. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Mauricio. It's very nice to see theorems that are applied for the research now, right? We are always working on applied research for a future, and this is just for now, for today, and it's so important to find economic ways of increasing the testing. Thank you so much.
My pleasure.
I think now we will start, then we finish our block, first block, and we'll start with the questions from the speakers. We have received questions now for, I will start with Paulo, who was Paulo Silva, who was the first one. Professor Joao Guilherme Pozo from University Center FEI. He asked Paulo how demographic density is computed in the models that you talked about.
Okay, in those kinds of compartmental models, usually the density of the population is taken into account into the R0 parameter, the basal reproduction number. Typically, in regions with more density, the virus can spread more easily, so the reproduction number will be higher. And in regions which are less dense, where people meet less each other, the reproduction number will be lower. So basically, it's the reproduction number that is the parameter in this kind of model that takes into account the overall dynamics of the population, and in particular, the density of the population.
Okay, thank you, Paulo. We have also a question for Pedro Gajardo. So Pedro, the question is from Daniel Gustavo Goroso from Research Technological Center, Mogi das Cruzes University. He asked if it is possible to introduce economic variables in mathematical models. He explains, the need for work makes people leave the house, mainly in the case of people with informal work. Can you take it into account in your model?
Yeah, sure. That's the idea to model this kind of things in this model. So our first approach was to try to minimize the days in lockdowns, because there is a proxy. It is like a proxy of the social and the economical impact. But to introduce other economical or social variables in the model, I think it is possible, but I see two ways to have an objective function with scalarize many quantities, or other one is the multi-criterion approach, and to try to get what are the optimal Pareto optimal profiles, because the quantities are not comparable. The economical aspect, the social aspect, the death. So yes, this is the idea, and of course it is possible.
Okay, thank you, Pedro. Thank you very much. I will now ask a question that arrived for Paulo again. So we go back. We go back to Paulo. Let me put the video. Okay, so the question for Paulo is from Alessandro Ala from Mathematics Department in PUC Rio. And it's 3 questions, in fact. So I will ask maybe one by one, Paulo.
Okay.
So the first question is if you can give details about the numerical method that you are using to control the problem.
Okay, so we are discretizing the problem and solving it as an optimization problem, nonlinear programming problem, and we are using IP-opt, which is I forgot the name now. Interior point method for nonlinear programming problems. Okay, we are actually modeling everything in jump, so we can actually use any kind of solver that has an interface to jump. So we can change the inner solver if that is necessary for some reason. So we are using a off-the-shelf solver.
Okay, question 2. Thank you, Paulo. The dimension of the control problem, what is the dimension of R that you can deal with this numerical method, and why it is not possible to go beyond more than 10 cities?
The problem is that the horizon to simulate is quite large. So we have many variables, and they can go up to tens of thousands and maybe hundreds of thousands of variables. If you go to, I don't know, 50 cities, you already have something like hundred of thousands of variables, which is quite large. The problem is fully coupled because of this. We are taking into account the interrelationship between the regions. So we cannot split this problem easily. And that is the main reason why we cannot deal with a very large number of cities. And actually, the problem is not really time, it's more like memory. At this moment, if you go to 50 cities, we have something like 64 gigabytes of memory being used by the system. And if you go to 100 cities, we'll probably go to, I don't know, 256 gigabytes, and it's a very, very large number. So we are trying to avoid this by using different techniques.
Okay, thank you. And then the third question, and we will let you rest, Paulo. It's, do you have some ideas on how to work with higher dimensional cities or problems?
Yes, sure. Actually, we try to outline what is our approach now at the end of the talk in this direction. So basically, it's easy to see that you can get rid of some of the state variables. So you can decrease the number of variables by 5, I would say. There are some small details that we have to take into account because of the modeling language we are using, and we are trying to solve these details right now, but we hope we can get something in that direction soon. We also need to introduce some kind of sliding horizon technique to allow us to avoid the end of the world problem that is usual in control when you have an infinite horizon. And this is something which is quite well studied in control. We have to borrow those ideas from the control literature and put in our model. We haven't done that before because of basically time. We have started this research a little bit more than 1 month ago. And we had to write the code and get the data and run simulations. So but of course we have to do this kind of things, and we hope we can get to hundreds of cities by the end of this.
Okay, thank you very much, Paulo. Now we go to Pedro. A question for Pedro. No, sorry, not Pedro. A question for Maurício from Jose Cuminato from São Carlos, CeMEAI. Maurício, the question is, how precise is the PCR testing? How much precision do you lose from this testing if you pull? Do you have some notion?
That's very, yes. So that's a very interesting question. So when you do a PCR test, really you do 2 tests. One, which checks whether the PCR is working in the sense that there have been RNA amplification of any RNA, and additionally you do one which checks whether which checks for the RNA amplification of the virus. Okay, so when you do a PCR test, you actually could get three possible answers. You could get yes, in which case you are certain that the answer is yes. You could get no, case in which you're certain that the answer is no. But you could also get a third answer, which is the test didn't work. Okay, because the amplification of the total RNA did not operate as expected. okay? So when you do pooling, what happens is that it might make more likely that the third option occurs when you know that the test didn't work and then you have to repeat it. But this is a very unlikely scenario. And if you do pools of less than 8, it basically never occurs. If you start pooling more, if you pool 16 or even 20, then there are moments in which the RNA amplification didn't operate and you lose information. But within the ranges that we are interested in doing it in Colombia, it produces absolutely no loss of precision. It's the same pooling as it is not pooling in terms of the quality of the information you obtain.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much, Mauricio. We have a set of questions from Maria Soledad Arona, and I think after that we will close the oral questions. It's for Paulo and for Pedro. So we let you rest, Mauricio, for now. Thank you. And so I will start with Paulo. So Maria Soledad Arona from EMAP FGB Rio de Janeiro. She's asking about the value of R0 in the cost functional, if it is the same for all the locations, and it's estimated at the beginning of the epidemic without mitigation.
Yes, actually, we are using a single R0 in the code right now, but the correct thing to do would be to consider different possible R0s at each region, and we have to estimate them for each region, because as I answered before, it takes into account the specificities of the region, like the density of the population and the economic profile of the people and things like that. So she's correct. The best would be to have a specific R0 for each region.
Okay, then we have another question from Soledad. When you say severe closing or lockdown, of which order do you mean? How much do you restrict the contact rate?
It has to be something that goes, the R0, the final R, the reproduction number has to go below 0, okay? So we are actually assuming 0.8, which is something that has happened in the countries in Europe, like Italy, Spain, and Germany. They have gone actually lower than that in the reproduction number. And that would mean a very strict lockdown, like the one that happened in those regions of the world.
Okay. Okay, thank you. And last question for Paulo. Regarding discretization, oops, they're arriving, okay. More questions, sorry. Regarding discretization, do you discretize to get more applicable controls or just to solve the finite dimensional optimization problem instead of the optimal control one? This is a little bit too technical, so sorry, Soledad, maybe we can continue this in a private channel, okay?
Yes.
Or unless you have a very short answer.
No. Basically, we're trying to solve a finite dimensional problem. We're not thinking at this moment very deeply on what we're doing there, but certainly I would be happy to talk to her about it.
Okay, this is nice to start identifying interested people and getting into this type of problematics and knowledgeable ones. So for Pedro Gajardo now, a question from Soledad Arona from FGB Rio de Janeiro. She asks in the data fitting if you fitted the parameter phi that gives a proportion of symptomatic and detected cases. And which is the value and how much do you trust this estimate, Pedro?
Yes, that's an important question. Actually, we don't calibrate this parameter. We show different scenarios related to different values of this parameter. So by default, we assume it's 50-50. But we show different scenarios. In one scenario, many people is symptomatic, few people is symptomatic. So we show all these scenarios, but we don't know. By default, we use 50-50, but we really don't know. So we don't fit this parameter.
Oh, yeah, of course. Our models are as good as the data that we have, and this is
sure. Yeah. Yeah. Now we will know some estimation about this with the seroprevalence study that is started in many countries.
Yeah. Perhaps their stochastic programming and uncertainty can also have a role.
Yes.
That makes even more complicated the problems.
Sure.
So we have a last question now for Mauricio, And with that, we will close the session of questions because I think it will be time to move on. Mauricio, Aloisio Segurado is asking, what is the impact of pooling samples in test sensitivity due to sample dilution? Mauricio is there?
Yes.
Maybe.
Yes,
Yeah.
so I think it's related with the previous question.
Mm-hmm.
The answer is it's minimal if you're pooling small amounts. If you pool 50 people, then it's very bad. If you pool a small amount of no, wait, one second. Sample dilution. Okay, so the problem is that in order to create the pools, so there are two numbers one has to look at. One is the size of the pools, which relates with the previous question, and is what I just answered. But the other one is how many times do you use each sample? Yeah, because I only have a finite amount of fluid that's coming from the person. In the experiments we have done in the lab, which are all done with nasal swabs, you can do 3 or 4 per person, and you still have more than enough fluid to be able to use the PCR with certainty. So we are within the realm where this doesn't matter. Eventually, this becomes a big problem. If I wanted to reuse every sample 10 times, this is unreasonable. But again, this is something that is not problematic for us in the context we have. Of up to 8 pools and up to 3 reuses per person.
Okay, I think also that something nice in your approach is that you can see as a function of the prevalence strategy, because if you have some doubts about your data, that can give you also an idea of the robustness of the strategy that you are choosing, right? If you
very much. In fact, something that we're currently doing with the engineering group at the university is to connect this with an artificial intelligence mechanism to predict the prevalence in advance. And this probably will lead to even further savings of resources.
Okay, thank you very much, Mauricio. I want to thank the 3 speakers for this very intensive and very nice set of discussions. Now we will pass then to the second block. The second block devoted to tools to support the design of public policies. The first one also had tools to support the design of public policies, but we had to find titles for the 2 blocks. So the first speaker in our second block is Juan Carlos de los Reyes from Moderator in Escuela Politécnica Nacional in Ecuador. So the word is with you, Juan Carlos. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Claudia. Let me share the screen. Okay, you can see that, okay?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. So let me start by thanking FAPESP and especially Claudia for this invitation to give the talk here. I'm very glad. It's a very interesting webinar concerning these applications in South America. And well, I will talk specifically about the work that we have been done in Ecuador concerning the modeling strategies, but also the parameter estimation with something which is specifically hard in Ecuador, which is the uncertainty in the data. This is a joint work with Paula Castro, Pedro Merino, and Joan Ponce from Moderator, and Joan is in the University of Purdue. And I will start by something which all you know, and it's quite interesting in the context of the modeling of this SARS-CoV-2 disease. And it's the fact that there are some particularities of the disease in this case that make the modeling challenging. And Pedro talked about that some minutes ago. One of the main issues is the number of infected people that develop weak symptoms or no symptoms at all, the so-called asymptomatics, which amounts 82 to 90%, which are people that even if they don't have the symptoms, they are very active in the contagious phase, and they have a specific and strong role in the dynamics of the models. A part of that, we have more than 25% of infected persons that are completely asymptomatic. And one of the important things about the disease is that 1 out of 6 persons develop a severe disease, especially the elderly and the people with pre-existing health conditions, and around 3%, that depends on the location, of the infected people die from the associated effects of the disease. Now, concerning the modeling specifically, we made some assumptions for the model to make it work. In our case, the one is that there are no reinfected people in the model. So either the people that are infected recover permanently or die. There is no reinsertion in the model in the dynamics. A part of that, the transmission rate is the same between people of different ages. This is a simplified assumption that we made at this point because of the difficulty of getting the parameter estimation of the disease in the different ages and across them. The transmission rate of asymptomatic, this is a crucial assumption. The transmission rate of asymptomatic infected people is a fraction of the symptomatic one due to the lower viral load. In the latency period, in the exposure time, there is no contagion in that phase. And a part of that, we don't expect the vaccine in the short term, and the provinces that we are analyzing are isolated from each other. Obviously, the ideal case is an integrated model where the regions are studied together, but we don't have the mobility pattern so far, and we couldn't do such an integrated model at that point. So what we use actually is pretty close to what Pedro presented before. We have some compartments of the model. We have the susceptible population that gets in contact with the virus and then becomes exposed to the population. Exposed means that during that period, the virus is in this latency, in this period of non-contagion. And then afterwards, the exposed population becomes either infected, reported in this case, or infected unreported in this compartment. And that means the infected reported are the people that really have severe symptoms and go to the system, while the other ones are the complete asymptomatic, as well as the weak symptomatic persons that don't get to the hospital or the health system as such. And afterwards, from these two compartments, the population is removed. Either they recovered or they die, but the removed population means in this case that they are not contagious anymore. And a part of that, we added a compartment on the deaf population that it's been asked by the authorities quite a lot in these last months. So what we use, actually, we have the model parameters, and the model parameters are concerned with the transmission rate of the reported population, the symptomatic ones that we have to estimate. A part of that, the transmission rate of the unreported or the weak symptomatic or asymptomatic cases, which is a fraction of the previous one, and that's something that we also have to estimate. The fraction of infectious symptomatic people that are reported to the system is something which, as the question made before, is something that is quite open, is not really a fixed parameter, is something that we have to estimate, as well as the latency period and the days of the infectious period that we jointly have to estimate in the model. A part of that, there are some fatality rates, which are much more studied so far, and the population of each province that we have to study. Now, the model itself contains these variables, and we impose on these variables some intervals. I apologize for the Spanish in some slides. These intervals are between 2 and 5 days in the case of the latency period, between 1 and 5 in the contagious phase. The alpha, which is the fraction of individuals that get symptomatic, is quite open in this case. Is between almost 0 and 1, and we have some estimates concerning the disease rate, and all this information is in this source which is kind of a nice web page that synthesizes the whole literature parameters that are going around. So in the case of the model itself, in each province, isolated province, what we have is a differential equation concerning the whole compartment model that we have at hand. And in this case, what we obtain in red is the whole parameter set that has a strong effect on the dynamics of this ODE system. In this case, of course, in the reality, when you do simulation, you have to take into account some stochasticity of the terms that are involved here, as well as in the parameters themselves. But for the time being, this model is kind of an ODE system. As Paulo mentioned, it's not that hard to solve. You can solve with an explicit method without any problems. But the essential key is to how the parameters are fitted and what happens with the different parameters where you play with them around, and what happens with the dynamics of the disease in that case. So what we did in that previous phase, in our case, in the first weeks, was to play a little bit with the coefficients, and in that case, see what's happening with the dynamics afterwards. And we simulated a strategy of the opening of the economy in the society itself, and it was concerning a gradual opening of the society from the lockdown. The strategy consisted in keeping the 90% of the population in social isolation for 15 days, then drop to 75% of the population in isolation for the next 30 days, and then 50% of the population in the remainder of the time. And we simulated what's happening with the diagnostic tests with some diagnostics, with diagnostics in the epidemiological circles, in the zones of high risk, and what's happening when you really do that in an exhaustive, random way. And so what we did in that case was trying to help the authorities to make decisions and to insist a little bit on the importance of the diagnostics to control the epidemics. And what you can see here is some simulations concerning what's happening when you run more tests concerning the diseases or the symptomatic and asymptomatic infected. And we could at that point establish or convince some authorities that there was important to test quite strongly to get a flattening curve, which is wished in this context, right? So afterwards, what we tried to do was actually to guide some of the authorities and some of the citizens to how to behave, not in a long-term or a mid-term scenario where the dynamics of the ODE was pretty clear, but how to behave in the short term, in this week, what to do in this week. And so we had to take a look at the data that we had in Ecuador, and you can see here the data of infected people in 4 different provinces, and Pichincha is the province where Quito, the capital, is. And you can see that the curve is not really that damaging, but this is a province in the coast, and you can see that even in this case, you have a curve which doesn't make any sense. You have infected and you get negative numbers. You get more recovered individuals that the infected that you had at one point in the past. So it didn't make any sense. And this is the data that we had to work with. And that was the challenge in this context. And so the uncertainty in the data is quite big. And what we did actually was to consider a Bayesian approach in trying to incorporate this uncertainty in the modeling phase and in the solution of the parameter estimation problem. And so what we assumed actually is the typical method of the map estimator, is we consider Gaussian density probability functions both for the observations and for the parameters themselves. And with these conditional probabilities that we have for the observations given the parameters and for the parameters itself, these are nothing else than Gaussian formulas. Thanks thanks to the Bayes theorem, what we can do is actually try to find the theta, the parameters that maximize this conditional probability, which is actually equivalent to maximize this part here. And we look after the parameters or the set of parameters, theta, that equivalently minimize this sort of least squares problem, where the important parts are actually this matrix C and this matrix B, which are, there is a -1 missing here, I'm sorry for that. And there is the importance of these matrices gives you the weight between one term and the other for the parameter estimation. And these are the covariance, the error covariance matrices and the background covariance matrix in this case. So what we tried to do in this parameter estimation problem was actually to minimize the discrepancy with respect to the reported infected statistics on one hand, but use also a priori information about the confidence intervals for the parameters and to estimate the parameters. And we wait with these covariance matrices and these background matrices, and we solve each variational problem in a 7-day time window. And each time, in each week, we change, actually we update the matrices and try to solve that accordingly. So what we did with the observation error covariance matrix is actually to consider the percentage of error of the PCR tests, which are quite good actually, but they have nevertheless an error, a covariance error, which we call sigma PCR here. And what we did is actually to consider a different kind of variance depending on how many tests per million of inhabitants you have in a given country. So the full credibility is given to the 4,000 weekly tests per million inhabitants, which is the German case. And according to that, we set the constant C equal to 4,000. And if you change that M number, then you get either more variance or less variance, which is typically more in our case. But in that case, you believe less in the data, and your model is incorporating that uncertainty in the estimation. So the model itself is a Bayesian inverse problem. The constraints are given by the model itself. And what we try to do is to minimize this least squares term when you get the official data, which is given here, the error covariance matrix, the previous estimates that you get from for the parameters. We can, at the beginning, we took that from the literature, and the background matrix that we have here to compensate both terms. And a part of that, we get some admissibility intervals for the variables themselves. And with those estimates, we can actually compute the effective reproduction number, RT. So I think I'm going to skip this slide. This is pretty clear that the RT is a strong indicator of the potential of the disease, and is something that you have to estimate on a periodic basis to give an account of the disease itself. This is a plot of what's happening or what happened in March concerning the estimation of the RT parameter, and you can see that the fitting is not really passing through the red points, and that's because we didn't believe that much in the data at that point. So you compensate that with the information you have from other places concerning the parameters, and that's a more robust way of doing the estimation in this case. This is the last week status of different provinces in the country. So we have a historic overview of what's happening with the reproduction numbers in each province, which are approaching 1, but none of them is below 1 at this point. But we keep tracking of this reproduction number in each week. So this is what we do actually concerning the forecast. So we forecast the reported infected cases. For that, we use ensemble methods due to the stochasticity that we have involved in the models. So we perturb the parameters, we perturb the initial conditions, and we perturb terms on the ODE themselves. And we run, in this case, I think it was around 100 simulations, and we take the main model, the dominating model, for doing the predictions in each province on a 2-week period basis. With this data, of course, what we can do, and Pedro showed that in detail, is from the infected symptomatic, you can do some queuing theory to see what's happening on the hospitals and the disease cases and how many beds you need and UCIs and stuff like that. And a part of that, what we did is actually to implement this information in in a mobile application that gives you the citizen a probability. This is the 76% in the historical part of Quito. And according to where you move, you can take a look at what the probability of getting contagious is around you. And you can take measures concerning that stuff. And for this probability, we use for sure their effective reproduction number that we have to compute each week. So as conclusions, we mainly try to convince the authorities, partly successful, partly not, that the mathematical models allow us to understand the dynamics of the spread of the disease, and we can simulate with that, with those models, what the public policy's effectiveness is concerning the different strategies. The main indicator of the aggressiveness of the epidemic is the effective reproduction number. We do that on a weekly basis. We update those computations to get clear about what's happening with the disease. And for the estimation of the parameters of the models, as well for the calculation of the effective reproduction number, we have to take into account the uncertainty in the data. We cannot get rid of that. We cannot believe actually completely in what the data is saying. And of course, the simulations show that there are decisive complementarity factors, which are the social distancing and the early detection, which is quite known by now. And but at the beginning was not that clear for the authorities. And so this is pretty much what I wanted to show you.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Juan Carlos. Very interesting. It's uncertainties is a big element in all these models. And those who have already attended some of my talks know that I always say that models are imperfect, but they are useful, right? And the example, the prime example is the map that Christopheros Columbus had to navigate, and anyway, it was possible for him to arrive in America. He thought he was arriving somewhere else, but well, models are imperfect. They can be perfected, and this is what mathematics is good for, and but they are always very useful. Okay, so thank you. Now we'll pass to our second speaker. Is Francisco Louzada from ICMC, USP, and CeMEAI in Brazil. Thank you, Francisco.
Okay. Just a second, I just share my screen with you. So hello everybody. I just would like to someone confirm to me that you are listening.
Yes, that's okay.
Okay, thank you very much. So first I'd like to give you my compliments to the presenters and to the audience. And also I'd like to thank you, FAPESP, and the organizers for giving me the opportunity to talk about our safety stock expert system. And particularly it is a system for predicting the demand for supplies during the COVID pandemic. So this is a joint work with several researchers. Indeed, it's a multidisciplinary team that was be able to finish the research in 1 month. So I'm very proud of work with them. And well, they are a team which has researchers from applied mathematics, computing, medicine, nursery, and statistics. It's a team from Bionex, which is a company, medical company, and a team from our CeMEAI, from USP. So just pointing out the outline of our talk, first I contextualize the problem. present which is our challenge nowadays, our solution for this proposal. After that, I point out all the information flow for the safety stock expert system. And finally, I point out some impacts that you are observing from our research. So first, I want to point out about the news to date related to the personal protective equipment shortage. Well, indeed, what happened that we have an explosive demand related to the COVID pandemic. So the production of this protective equipment is not enough, and you can have shortage of them. One thing that is important, I just yesterday I made a Google search with the words PPE shortage and another one with personal protective equipment shortage, and they return a huge amount of results in English and in Portuguese. So this, in some sense, indicates the importance of the topic under the pandemic situation that you are nowadays. Just a few news from Brazil, just recent news from Brazil. You see, for example, research shows that 50% of the physicians report PPE shortage. Another one, health professional report recycling PPE. So only these two news synthesize, in some sense, the huge problem that you have nowadays in predicting how many personal protective equipment you need to have in a hospital. So which our challenge nowadays is to building an easy-to-use expert system to predict the demand for personal protective equipment in hospitals during the COVID pandemic. So the idea is providing safety stock level to avoid possible PPE shortage during the COVID pandemic, but also maintain adequate patient care. But we need to avoid unnecessary expenses by the hospitals, since the PPE price have increased a lot during this pandemic time. So we propose a statistical model which combine three different kinds of data. Epidemiological data related to the disease, historical data on the consumption of personal protective equipment by the hospitals, and the current protocols for their use. So by the end, the modeling can provide this, the safety stock for a particular hospital. This is the main structure. So the idea is first to build statistical predictive models for the demand of PPE, and then embed our model in a free expert system, which you call safety stock. So from now on, I call our expert system of safety stock. So the safety stock, it provides the demand of PPE over time. It indicates the moment when the hospital reach the maximum assumption. It estimates how long the hospital will work on this stage, and after that, when it will decrease. So this is the main objective of our safety stock. So just to point out the information flow for the predictive model, we are based on three main information sources. So in the first step, as I said before, I start to assessing the pandemic situation in the hospital city by picking epidemiological information. In the second step, we have also hospital premises to define the team size. For example, the number of nurses, physicians, physiotherapists that are using in the hospital, as well as the PPE consumption in the light of the COVID context. In the third step, we integrate these two first information steps on the historical consumption of a particular PP. So here you have the sequential modeling structure that is provided for the epidemiological information. First, you have the reported ads, and from that, we can obtain the reported that estimate curve and made some sequential modeling structure and have the regional demand curve, and finally you have the hospital demand estimate curve that are all of them are here. This is an example for São Paulo city and for Belo Horizonte city, and by the end you obtain indeed the estimate of how long the hospital will work on the maximum consumption, which is the plateau end. Particularly here, it's important just to put two examples. We have one situation in Belo Horizonte for a hospital that there is no problem since we are very far from the plateau. But here we have some problem. The problematic situation may be bad until August, or at least a little bit more than August in São Paulo. From the epidemiological information, it is important to point out that we have used several different kinds of statistical distributions that are using each one of the steps that you are modeling. For the step 2, now you have the maximum PPE consumption that reaches a particular hospital, and this was provided to us by the Bionexo team. There are some assumptions for the maximum consumption of a hospital, and this is indeed a simulated hospital. So you have a simulated hospital with all the data that they could provide to us in order to find the height of the plateau. So here we define a reference for the maximum consumption that reach the hospital. And in the third step, we saw considering we joined the plateau end, the plateau end curve and the height of plateau estimated in step 1 and step 2 with the historical consumption of some special PPA. And by the end, you have as output the consumption curve. This consumption curve is composed by the consumption prediction horizon. We have the plateau end with the uncertainty margin. And also we have the scenario for the maximum consumption based on step 2. So it's important here that we can in each one of these plateaus we can determine how long the stock will survive. For example, in this case here you have a stock that will last at least for 28 weeks, and since we started to increase the plateau, the number of weeks that the stock will last, it starts to reduce. Well, this is this safety stock layout, and you can go directly to the homepage of our platform using this address. And it's important that for having these results, the hospital needed to input some kind of information. Particularly here, you put the consumption, the consumption of the hospital, the information about the city, the state, and the specific entries for prediction, specific entries for regional and related to the hospital. And by the end, we can observe that with our prediction, the hospital can have estimated its needs related to a specific PAP, and the predictions allow for the adoption of some strategy to control and keep the stock safety at safety levels, particularly mitigate risk of shortage and maintain adequate patient care. So this indeed could be seen as a cultural impact, since our model promotes the improvement of the hospital knowledge in making evidence-based decisions directly benefit the community. And also, you see a second use for the stock save as well, since our model enables interchange and the cooperation between hospitals, maximizing care during the pandemic. This can be seen as a financial impact, since our model in this situation promotes a process of optimization and cost reduction. And particularly here, come back in the layout of the hospital, you have a flag to ask for help for the bionex help that will keep the relationship and make the contact between hospitals that need to borrow some PAP or someone that can borrow some PAP. So all the results that I have shown here and all the theoretical part that we have used, we condensate in a manuscript, which is in this preprint server for health science. So it's possible to go there and get the preview PDF for free. And also, we'd like to say that the results obtained with the safety stock were exposed to some PAPA managers for some Brazilian hospitals. And the degree of agreement with the reality, it's very, 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 very accurate, and this activity encourages to continue the development, maintenance, and dissemination of our research in the free expert system. So that's it I'd like to say. Thank you very much. And if you have some doubt, I will be available.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much, Francisco. It's very interesting. There's those logistic questions that arise in this time of augmented demand. Of course, it's something fundamental. Thank you very much. So we'll pass now to our last speaker. Last but not least is Pablo Lotito from PLADEMA, Facultad de Ciencias Exactas, and CONICET in Argentina. So the word is with you, Pablo. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you, Claudia, for the invitation, and thank you to the FAPESP staff for the organization. I will present some developments using applied math for COVID-related problems in Argentina. First, I will talk about the current situation in Argentina. Then I will enumerate a few math projects that are working now in Argentina, in our country. And finally, I will talk about two of them currently undertaken in the research team I work. The epidemic situation is the following. The data corresponds to the report given on last Tuesday. More than 80% of the confirmed infections are located in the city of Buenos Aires and around. The total reported yesterday was around 18,000 infected people and a total of 566 deaths. The total of new confirmed case was yesterday 904, taking the total today to 268 cases. The maps on the right show the number of cases and its proportion with respect to the number of inhabitants on each state, on each province. The today observed fatality rate is 3.2%. And we have also another disease that merits attention. It is dengue, that since a year ago accumulates more than 40,000 cases, more than COVID, but with a much lower number of deaths. In the city of Tandil, there has been only 4 cases already recovered since more than a month ago, but in the surrounding cities of Necochea, Azul, and Olavarria, recently imported cases made the number of infected starting to grow in those cities. These are the daily cases. Here you can see the daily evolution of the number of infected cases since the first confirmed case in the 4th of March this year. You can also see that the population segment most infected is the middle-aged people, but the most affected are older people. Also can be seen that gender has a relative lower impact. That was the epidemic situation, and since the COVID spread, many researchers in Argentina started to work in the subject. More than a month ago, the National Ministry of Research and the National Agency of Research launched a call for projects related to COVID. From the Applied Mathematical Society of Argentina, an online survey of COVID project was made. From this survey, from the answers to this survey, and from the list of approved projects in the column I mentioned before, we have some research teams working on simulation in the universities of Córdoba and Buenos Aires, a research network with researchers from Salta, Bariloche, Buenos Aires, and Tandil working since 2010 on simulation of infectious diseases with individual-based models. They are working now with COVID, but also with dengue. In Tandil at PLADEMA, a team led by Rubiales and Rizzo obtained a grant for the centralized management of health resources, and they plan to include an evolution model in the system. Also at PLADEMA, and jointly with Opticom from Rosario, Lisandro Parente, Justina Giannati, myself, and others, obtained another grant for the simulation and control of the disease that we are starting next week. Finally, at the Technological University of Bahía Blanca, a team led by Victor Cortines is working on the control of the disease. Plans for cooperation are to follow with them. In this joint work with Opticom and PLADEMA, we are working on a simple 7 compartments model and a stochastic version of it provided by the research network I mentioned before. We are working also with an age-structured model, and we are using optimization for parameter estimation. We are planning to follow with the optimal management of resources and the control and optimal control of intervention strategies. It is important to note that our lab developed the tracing software used by some states in our country, so we hope we will have good and enough data for our studies. Some words about our simulator. It is inspired on the epidemic simulator that was viralized at the beginning of the pandemic. We completely recoded it for ourselves in order to understand the model, and we added some other functionalities, like, for example, the duration of the intervention. We wanted to observe the impact of isolation measure and its duration on the disease evolution. It has 7 compartments which are susceptible, exposed, infected, recovered, hospitalized, and fatalities. And in the simulation tool, all the parameters can be manually set up. Then the start date and duration of this isolation can be modified to observe the variations on the peak and the number of intensive care units. The level of isolation is modelized with a reduction of the reproduction number coefficient. Here you can see that after an isolation of 100 years, starting on day 61, with a reduction of 52% of the reproduction number, the peak is 17,000, less than half of what would have been without intervention. We have also a peak retardation of 100 years. Finally, some words about the age structure model that Frederick Bonanza and Justina Giannati are working on. The interesting thing is that this model is able to model the delay on the dynamics that one would expect due to the incubation period. Here, the population is divided in 2 or more groups, strong and weak regarding risk, or young and old regarding age, represented in the model by the variable A. I don't know if you can, voila. The variable A now enters in the definition of the variables, also with the time. This is the classical equation of the SIR model. Now the new equation is this one. We have, for the infection number, the number of infected people, we also have another variable B that represents the age of the infection. Now in the equation, evolution equation, we have a infection parameter that depends on the age, a control that affects the infection parameter, the total number of infected people, which is the sum of all the infected people for all ages and all infection ages. And with this model, they minimize a combination of the peak number of infected, the confinement cost, and the death toll, with restrictions on strength of the confinement and its duration. The numerical results they obtain are represented here and in the next slide. Here, a control objective of reducing the peak and the number of death is used, together with a restriction on the duration of the confinement. This restriction on the confinement is different for each group. In the first graph on the left, you can see the obtaining isolation program, which is stronger on the weaker group. The peak and the death toll is reduced with respect to the non-controlled case. In this case, the optimization criterion has a higher weight for the peak, obtaining a quasi-periodic control. This control imposes isolation when the number of infected cases increases, and releases isolation when this number decreases. As you can see in the lower left graph, after some time of confinement, the number of hospitalized starts to decrease. But as the number of immunized people is still too small, when the confinement is ended, the number of infected cases starts to grow again. They found that this could be a good strategy that does not overwhelm the health system, and this situation is similar to the one presented in the first lecture by Paulo Silva. Well, I have presented the epidemic situation in our country, enumerated some working themes in the subject, and presented the basic directions we are following in my team. As I mentioned, we have made the parameter calibration with weighted least squares, given more weight to the recent observations. Now, we are looking forward to validating this or to finding other ways for guaranteeing good forecasting results. As Claudia said, we are in a marathon. Our team started recently, but we hope to catch up with you.
Okay, thank you, Pablo. Thank you very much for this panorama of activities. So now we'll start the section. Thank you very much for the talk. Now we'll start with the questions. And I have a first question that is for Juan Carlos de los Reyes. And there was something that I also was thinking. Juan Carlos, could you please comment what was the process that led the government to be convinced by the following the advice that you were proposing? I'm saying that because I think it is important, and it's something that we sometimes as applied mathematicians neglect. It is very important to have very sophisticated models, but that is what we are comfortable with. But then we need somehow to translate that into a very simple message that that reaches people who is not knowledgeable of the techniques that we are using. And this is something that is fundamental during these pandemics. And sometimes maybe we seem in not doing that very well. So I would be glad that you share your experience in this sense, if you can, please.
Sure, Claudia. I cannot start the video though. I don't know why, but maybe there's some centralized control on the video. I don't know. Anyway, I can answer the question. Actually, what we did from the beginning on, a part of the developing the mathematics and the modeling was actually to develop a communication strategy. And so what we, with the help of the university, of course, there's a communication direction there. And what we did was having a lot of presence in some media and trying to come through the media with a simple message. And the strategy was actually to have the presence in the media to convince the authorities through the media that they should take care about several issues that okay, now it works, that were important for the propagation of the disease. So afterwards, of course, what we did was establishing contacts with mostly local governments, not the national one in principle. And we had a lot of help of the international organization, the OPS and the World Health Organization. And they helped a lot at some point to spread that network of contacts and to be able to get some impact in that respect. But I agree with you. So there was a huge effort on the communication strategy and not only on the modeling one.
Okay, thank you very much. It's really important that we are able to communicate the value of what we do, and well, for that we need a communication team, experts in communication. This is true. It's really an interdisciplinary work, and having these people, but these people have to know also to understand a little bit the type of problems we are dealing with. It's not something that they can learn from one day to the next one. It builds this. So at CeMEAI, there is a communication team, for example, and then they can understand better what we do and they can transmit it better. They translate it into the language.
Exactly, that's the issue.
That is very valuable I don't know, well, probably afterwards we can make a turn in all the speakers to see what is the experience in their own centers. So thank you. I will pass now to the second question. So it's a question for Francisco. Francisco, can you comment on what do you mean by free expert system? When you say that the expert system is free, what does it mean?
Right. Well, indeed, you have a system that can be accessed for any hospital that have interest to realize how is going the consumption of this PPA. So, I mean, if you have this intention, if you need help, it's possible just to go through our system and start to use. That's it. And it's very easy. It's very friendly. And we have now a video that show how to use the system for the hospital as well. So it's very simple.
That's very nice. It goes along those lines that I was saying.
Yeah. So I mean, all hospitals that needed to use the system will be welcome to go there and start to use. That's it.
Okay. Okay. Well, thank you. Thank you. So and then we have a question for Pablo. It says, like each one got a question here. The question is from Héctor Ramírez from Universidad de Chile, and it goes as follows. Population in Argentina has been confined since at most the beginning of the outbreak. This is possible the reason why the figures are relatively low comparing other Latin American countries. However, there is an important source of uncertainty when they release this lockdown. Have you thought about other exit strategies besides feedback activation of lockdown after releasing the lockdown? So are you aware of some actions in this sense, Pablo, in Argentina?
There is no action implemented right now, but they are talking about a mixed strategy, a kind of a strategy as Paulo Silva commented before, the opening of some part of the city or some kind of shops, but today there is nothing clear about that. I don't hear you.
Oops, sorry.
I don't hear you. Claudia, you are muted. You are muted.
I know. I unmute myself. I get muted again, but now I came back. Okay, well, thank you. It's is there some kind of geolocalization app or something that is being put in place?
Yes.
Maybe?
Yes, there are two. There are two applications. One is made in our team. Is used in some states, and there is another application from the national government which is used in Buenos Aires. Mm. It allows to trace the people.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and probably to get better data. Okay, so I think we are getting close to the wrap-up time. It's we're more or less on schedule. Let me say I'm very happy with this meeting. It's we are being bombed with information from all sides, but I think we got a good idea of things that are being done and different techniques, and perhaps we can identify possible collaborations. Something that I thought of during these talks is on the importance of have a consolidated group of researchers, maybe not working on this exact problem of COVID, but who already knew each other. For example, us at CeMEAI, and this allows for a very fast response because we already knew what each one can do and put that together. And this is very important. It's the result of many years of research funding by FAPESP into our center. This is fundamental. I imagine it's similarly in Chile, CMM, or in Ecuador. So that is something that has to be valued, and because when the time comes, allows us to respond fast with effective tools. Something also that I would like now is to finish, is perhaps we can make a turn with all a little short interventions from each speaker. Will go in the order, and then we will I will close. Okay, so just final comments, perhaps. What are the challenges that you see, or the immediate needs, or things that might be useful to share with the listeners? Thank you. So we start with Paulo.
Okay, so I am also very happy for the result of this meeting. And I think I would like to stress one point that appeared in many talks, is that tests are very important. So if you want to have a good response to a situation like this, we need data, and good data allow us to use more sophisticated methods, like the methods I proposed and the methods that other people proposed, and also to do contact tracing and things like that. I think one of the main things that we can get out of these talks is that test is very important, and they open up the possibility of using more sophisticated methods and more smarter interventions, mitigations. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Paulo. So now we go to Pedro, please.
Yeah, thank you, Claudia. Also, I'd like to share some ideas how I see the big picture. I'm not a specialist in pandemics, so, but it's just my viewpoint of the big picture. I think it is necessary to identify a short-term, a mid-term, and a long-term research program. The short-term is now, okay? So I think we should provide result and message easy to communicate, as you said, and easy to implement. And ideally, if this message can be supported by a large group of specialists and also by other modeling teams, that where with other techniques, they arrive to the same conclusions. So in terms of the control theory, I think there is a need of feedback rules instead of open loop strategy to be implemented with reliable data and reliable information in some sense of robustness approach, but we have to do that now. For the midterm will be during the social convulsion that certainly we will have in our countries, because we cannot say that the political situation, the social situation before the pandemic was calm in some of our countries, in Chile, but in many others. So in the long term, means for me to be more prepared for future pandemics, but that will strongly depend on the relation between policymakers and the local scientific communities in each country.
Okay, thank you very much, Pedro. Now we'll pass the word to Maurício, please.
So maybe the situation in Colombia is slightly different than what we have seen in other countries. We started the lockdown very early, and as a result, our number of deaths are much smaller than those of other countries that we have discussed. However, we have by now seen also the consequences of quarantine. I mean, I realize that there is all this effort in trying to protect the people who are susceptible to COVID. But we also have to observe that there is a lot of people, especially in South America, who are susceptible to quarantine. In Colombia, for instance, we have 7% of the population in like extreme monetary poverty. This is 3 million people, badly counted, for whom the consequences of quarantine are really life-threatening. And so we really need to think of the global impact that the decisions have, and I'm telling you this after seeing, with my own eyes, the consequences of some of these policies, which are as scary or even scarier than COVID. And so, yeah, so we definitely need better data. We probably should go for contact tracing, which is something that there is some basic agreement as to what to do. But we also think but I also think that we need to use the information we already have better. For instance, I think that the main thing we have learned about COVID is what Juan Carlos explained extremely well, which is that it affects very different groups of people. And so all of our models should take the risk structure into account. And I did not see enough of that. And I think that this is unfortunate. And if we want to plan for an intelligent strategy to get out of this, to go back to the world we had before, so I don't believe in the new normality. I think this is not normality. We really need to go back to normal. We need to use that information. So I'm a strong believer on risk-based approaches and incorporating this in our control mechanisms. But I think that this is more a challenge for the future. I was very happy to see very interesting approaches like what Paulo did. It was very interesting seminar. So thank you for that.
Thank you, Mauricio. Thank you for these insightful comments. So now we pass to Juan Carlos. Let me comment, Juan Carlos, that we got a question for you from Oman, but I will pass it to you on the private channel, and then you can answer to the person afterwards, so that we don't extend further this webinar. So Juan Carlos, please, your final comments.
Thank you, Claudia. Well, I just wanted to stress what you said. Actually, it is important to build capacities. That's the main message that I try also to spread here. Is not for us, it was important to have this fast response, build it capacity from years of working with models. And I try to stress all the time that it is not an issue of a hobby. Let's do a modeling task from today to tomorrow and try to convince somebody. But it's really about having a group, having a center, having an institution. And also this network is kind of a sign of that. I mean, we know each other from years and years, and we can put together all these efforts and join efforts and try to do something in the region. And I would like really to insist and to stress on the importance of that initiative.
Okay, thank you, Juan Carlos. So now Francisco, some final comments from your side?
Right. Well, first, Claudia, I'm very pleased to participate from this webinar. It's a very important way of giving us the opportunity to show our research and what you have done at the university, how you can take this research and live until the community, until the industry, and so on. So this is very important to have this kind of channel that gives you this kind of opportunity. But well, it's when you have this kind of disease, when you have this kind of problem that started in few weeks, you need to solve some problem. Which is important to have good data. So I just pick up what Paulo said before, that it's very important to have good data. And you know that modeling is very important, but good data is much more. So this is a differential situation when if you have good data, you can have better models, you can have better results. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you, Francisco. So now the ball, since we are in a country that in a continent that likes football, the ball is in the field of Pablo.
Well, thank you. Well, as I said, we arrived late to the COVID fest, and as Hector Ramirez pointed out in his question, we had a strong lockdown from the beginning. And after 2 months of almost no economic activities, and with most of the cities without cases, many people are asking to release the lockdown. So this kind of research, of studies, are very important to show the authorities the implication of this release, or how to do it in a convenient way. That's why we are very interested in pursue this line of research.
Okay, thank you, Pablo. So I think we have reached the end of our webinar. I will just share with you a slide that I prepared. No, chat, no, let me see. I have to, let me see the one I want. Yes, this slide. Now 5. Okay. No, it is not this one. You see, it's what I, sorry. The moderator is confused. Okay, let me, I just want to show you a slide. Sorry, it's not what I should do. I will stop sharing. I want you to, my proposal is that we try to federate our efforts, not in a manner that becomes heavy and we are bombed with emails and all that, because we all have sufficient communication of this type, but perhaps through a platform, I don't know, I'm not sure yet how to do it, Slack, or where we can, if we make some progress and we write a report, we put it in that, we announce it in that place, and then people, it's like a window that where we will all be able to look at, and then keep updated. And then if there is interchanges that some people want to start from that, this will be well, this will be the starting point. So that, let me see if now I can find the slide that I wanted, because where did I put it? Well, I think I must have closed it. Okay. So what I will do is, since I don't know where I put my slide, is I will we will put in the web page of the meeting this contact. It was something like contacto ICMC CeMEAI, but I will. It's better that I send it to you, and I will send it to all the speakers. People interested in participating of this initiative can either send a mail to me or to live@fapesp.br if it is still active. So thank you very much for all this meeting in the name of CeMEAI and in the name of FAPESP. I say goodbye and hoping to see you soon. Goodbye.
Goodbye.